for HCI, because that in many cases the mathematics will not tell you very much, whereas just looking at the problem very carefully, non-mathematics will let you get to the heart of what many of the things that HCI require. Just a screen on in a program can be mathematically quite correct, and it will satisfy a mathematician, but it won't satisfy everybody. And it will.
Who might be among the unsatisfied?
Artists, of course. And I think that this is a very important area, and I can see why the mathematician really likes the idea of clean and absolutely right, and so what I'm interested in is taking the best from the mathematician and from the artist, and perhaps even with luck, having them work together.
Right.
And at that point, many very interesting things, I think, would happen. Not putting either of them down, making them, or not making, but asking them to work together and make something.
I think courses like this are moving in that direction, right? But it requires a real work. It requires work to figure out how to talk to one another. So, for example, the conversation that we were having a second ago about truth versus correctness, right? Or modeling and representation is a kind of one thing that happens, and then the actual use of that modeling in another context. So, the collide smash example that Damien's using versus what the measurement in the lab. Right? It's the interaction among those things that's difficult. Why? Because people with different disciplinary perspectives and different disciplinary languages want to privilege their language.
Yes.
And so the trick is how do we talk to one another where I don't privilege my language, right? And the people who are other than I am don't privilege theirs, right? And it requires, and that's the work of conversation. I think we'll get there. And I think the fact that we're having a class like this is moving us in that direction.
To continue this, I think that the artist and the mathematician are both involved in unconcealing. Both the artist and the mathematician are involved in some sort of unconcealing, going with that definition of truth. So my question is, is the authority that's placed on the mathematician, is that justified or is it arbitrary in some way? Why is that privileged?
Authority is an interesting word there. You know, why is one given more authority, and I'm not exactly sure what you mean by authority.
Well, I picked it up. You said it.
I used it, yeah.
In terms of that discipline having more authority in pursuing what we call truth, or the correctness or unconcealing.
Authority often is referred to here as a matter of deference. So we in the arts will defer to people in the pharmaceutical industry and the medical profession, right? It's sort of a deferral and a submissiveness. It also has to do with cultural authority. So we don't, we pay certain people more, right? And therefore they have, what they say and what they do has a different kind of weight. So if you think about authority in terms of deference and status and things like that, I think you'll start to understand that.
Well, I'll tell you a story. So, I personally believe that these different kinds of intellectual conversation are privileged in different communities.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not overall that one is overseen as other. I know many people in the humanities who look down on sciences.
Right. But they never do it with the same authority.
So, back in England, I used to date a woman who was a writer, and she'd written a few books. And when I first met all her friends, and we went out and were having dinner with about 6, and they were all in the literary professions, writers, editors, or historians, and they asked me what I did, and I explained about my PhD in artificial intelligence, and I now work with computer games. And one of them giggled and said, "Oh, you know, I can't do maths at all, I can't do mathematics," and they all laughed around the table. And so I said, "That's interesting, I've never read a novel, what's it like?" You know, and my girlfriend was kicking me under the table, because they treated me like I had learning disabilities for the rest of the evening. You know, like there was something wrong with me because I did. And of course I've read novels, but if they're related, I was just proving a point, you know. But so things are privileged in different communities.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of looked down and, oh, I don't do that. You know, that kind of example.
Part of my dissertation was on Copernicus's use of Virgil. And I studied this moment in the treatise on the revolution of heavenly spheres because I was interested in that where in history do we find that moment when scientific, so to speak, scientific authority, there really wasn't, the term scientific as we use it today wasn't really used until maybe the late 19th century. So it's a little bit of a distortion to talk about scientific authority in Copernicus. But I wanted to understand where did that shift begin to occur between poetic authority and scientific authority. And you can kind of see it happening quite clearly in the Copernican treatise, especially using these this Heidegger understanding of modern science's research. Essentially what happens is, gradually in terms of discourse, science claims that it speaks, and you see this in the Copernican treatise. I can show it to you. I can't demonstrate it right now, I don't think, but I can show you the passage at some point if you're interested. At some point, what happens is we have this phenomenal world where we just experience things, okay? And then Copernicus says, you know what? If something is mathematically consistent, right, but something is phenomenologically contradictory, let's basically tip the hand to mathematical consistency. So we have many different descriptions of the cosmos, but none of them are mathematically consistent, Copernicus says. So what he says is, what would it take if we created a mathematically consistent model of the heavenly spheres? Well, to make that happen, we have to put the sun at the center of the solar system. Okay? So what Copernicus does when he engages in this move, it's kind of hard to demonstrate this without actually looking at the text, but he takes a binary opposition that had never, as far as I know, had never been used before with this kind of cultural weight. He takes a distinction between the real and the apparent. Right? And he says mathematics helps us to distinguish between appearances and reality. And this is the moment, I think, the rhetorical moment in the history of Western science that establishes science as an authority over poetry. Okay, anyway, this is the argument that I made in the first chapter of my dissertation. So what happens is, how to say this, the artist, right, and the mathematician, we need to actually factor in some other kinds of actors here, because mathematicians and artists are closer, perhaps, than people who use mathematics. Let's just call them natural scientists or natural philosophers. to use a term for scientists that is more accurate in terms of historically speaking, right? Mathematicians are not people who usually care all that much about reality. Right? Is that the case? The ones that I know, they're really interested in what the numbers tell them, right? Where their mathematical reflections lead them. They may or they may not work out there in the real world. It's the folks who are doing the natural science, doing natural philosophy, maybe doing technology. It's the people who are applying mathematics, right? The ones who are using mathematics to assess the real.
And seeing the work of the artist to assess the real.
And so artists, many artists make use of mathematics, just like many natural sciences or people doing technology, right?
But I'd argue from Richard's point that, you know, these things exist separately, but they can both be abstract, but they both have a play on the, you know, development of technology, so the real is based on both. It draws from both.
Yeah. Now, the problem we have to remember about real here is that embedded in this is the problem that we talked about earlier in the semester, that reality and the real are not the same. Okay? So this is a postmodern distinction, this one that I'm making here. This is a postmodern distinction, but this is not a distinction that Copernicus or the tradition within the natural sciences has made. And so the friction or the tension in our own cultural moment between the natural sciences and the humanities that Richard Powers is kind of gesturing to in that passage that we were looking at earlier, that tension is really brought on by the fact that in our own conversations, we no longer just think about the real as being opposed to what's apparent. We think about the real as just being a category, a word that's full of contradictory concepts that we have to sort out with a different kind of vocabulary.
Does he make with the word apparent, does he say apparent whereas it's shaped by individual perception?
Here's what he does, okay? He says, you know what, the earth has a shape that looks like it's got the shape that would be appropriate for something that moves. And so, and when we look at, we've had all these studies about the earth among our ancient philosophers and our contemporary astronomers, and he goes, kind of rehearses the arguments about the shape of the earth and things like that. And then he says, you know, think about it. Imagine that you're setting forth on a, let me answer it very quickly rather than summarizing the whole thing. He's talking about optical illusions, okay? He says, you know what? When here we are on the surface of the earth, right? And it appears to us that the sun is rising and setting, okay? But he says, you know what? We're moving. The earth itself has a design or a shape that's appropriate for movement. The earth is in motion, right? But so too is the sun. And he says, so the movement that we see the sun moving, but that's an appearance, right? What's really real is the movement of the earth that factors in, right? So he wants to say, well, we see the sunrise and we see the sunset. We're seeing an optical illusion. We're caught up in an appearance. What's real, mathematical modeling teaches us, is that the movement is in the relative movement between the earth and the sun. Okay? So here's what he does in order to make that point with fewer words. He says, do you know what? Even Virgil's Aeneid knew about optical illusions. He quotes a line from Virgil's Aeneid at the very moment he announces the hypothesis. In other words, at the very moment in Western civilization, when Copernicus announces the hypothesis, he re-describes the very nature of the hypothesis itself. Our modern understanding of the hypothesis is only as old as Copernicus. Before Copernicus changed the meaning of the word hypothesis, what a hypothesis was a statement that a philosopher, an astronomer, a poet, anybody would make that would record and save the appearances of things. That's what a hypothesis was. So before Copernicus, if you went up to a poet and an astronomer and you said, what is it you do? They both reply in one way or another, I record and save the appearances of things. Okay? But after Copernicus, no, my hypothesis is something, it's a statement that I posit, that I put out there, It's my grounding principle, and I try to prove it right or wrong. I try to prove it true or false. I try to verify it. Right? I create little experiments along the way. Sometimes I can repeat them, and I'm getting attacked by Smith. Is that making some sense to you? Yes. So if you want, I can give you I can post the second chapter of my dissertation.
I was going to go back to powers and
Sure.
Can we go back to
Sure, you want to put it up on the screen?
Just this conversation we're having here is in this interview as well. Oops, missed it. See if I can find it. I've gone too far, I think. Oh, here we are. So a little bit up from where we were. This bit here. So he discusses the novel Galatea, and this is exactly the conversation I think we're having in this room. He says, we're trying to hold a dialogue between people who have devoted their lives to one whole set of intellectual assumptions and people on the other side of the line who have devoted themselves to completely separate and untranslatable assumptions. And I like that. You know, the people around that table in England were never going to learn mathematics. You know, they just weren't.
And that scene reminds me of the very, let me just give you the page numbers. The anecdote that you're telling, right, is very, very reminiscent of pages 36 to 48, 36 to 48. That's when the bet is made. That's when Richard Powers encounters Lentz and Diana invites him over. He's at that bar drinking. That whole scene reminds me of
the whole book has that conflict between Marcel and Lentz.
and also, but also the other scientists, right?
Yeah.
All the different scientists are represented there with Clover and Ram. I'm forgetting their names now. I haven't written down Diana.
Yeah.
But
and it stages a debate between cutting open monkeys, right? And remember the bad joke about Reese's Pieces? So it's in that scene where it's not just it's actually qualifying what Richard Powers is saying here. The debate isn't just between people who are on either side of the line. There are debates within people among the different groups on each side of the line as well. Right?
And that's what this course has been particularly fascinating to me, is that we're talking about the same things with completely different language. I don't have the language Patrick has to talk about these things. And it's all about language. You know, the way we break things down, problems, and talk about them in a different way. And I don't think they're untranslatable, but...
Right, I don't either. That's where so here's what I've been trying to do all along, right? I've been trying to find where if we dig down deep enough, so to speak, where do we have common ground? Where is the common ground among the disciplines? Right? If we could find that, then we would be able to at least find a place that we could go to where we could start to hear each other more clearly and learn from each other more quickly. So.
He talks specifically about the problem that when he says we're reaping he says at the bottom of that, we're reaping the harvest of that intellectual specialization that made us so successful. We've developed intellectually, we've got into this area where we can have higher education, but it does mean that we focus. There's that great diagram, I don't know if you've ever seen it, of about human knowledge. You know, you have the whole of human knowledge, and when you do your undergraduate degree, you're somewhere here. And then you do a master's degree where you learn a bit more. And with a PhD, you do that and create a pinnacle here. So there's this massive knowledge, you learn something, you learn a bit more, and you're that pinnacle over there. The idea of a PhD is you go to the edge and do that little dot. And because we're in these little focused domains, and all of us, as academics, You know, and thinkers, we live in these little boxes. You know, we go out to these little spots.
And we run into each other in the bar.
Yeah. Believe me, this university is better than most. In other universities I've been at, they never collide at all. You completely keep separate. But he says this is another interesting point he makes, which is something very relevant to what we're doing. He says the economics of higher education prevent the kind of interdisciplinary vision that he's describing, and it is true. Courses like this one are incredibly difficult to get going, and the digital humanities and things like that. Many universities, you know, don't like this sort of thing. They like to keep you in boxes. In England, you're actually penalised for being multidisciplinary as an academic. You know, you're expected to sit in one box or another. You know, that's the way the English system works. So it's different. But this is where he says, literary critics' work can only be enhanced by a more sophisticated sense of evolutionary paleontology, molecular biology, cognitive science, cosmology. You know, things that should know about.
And one of the points I was making last class, I can kind of reinforce and develop here, and that is I was pointing out to you how Galatea 2.2 is deliberately and self-consciously drawing on Dante's Divine Comedy. So you had that notion that my 35th year was lost. The Divine Comedy begins midway in life. I found myself lost in a dark wood. And at the very end of the novel, it's Lentz who says to Powers, "How old are you?" And he says 36. So we know that that lost year has passed. And then he says, "Darkling wood time again." So the point of this is that Dante was a poet and a writer who felt that it was necessary to take full awareness and full cognizance of all of the intellectual developments of his time. So one of the things that Dante is doing, it doesn't look this way to us because we see this ancient cosmology that he's drawing on, where he locates heaven in relationship to hell and earth and purgatory. But Dante is drawing on the best of the sciences of his time to create this massive cosmological poem. And so Powers is really kind of taking some of his inspiration from this guiding idea of Dante's, that poets are people who are aware of knowledge of their own historical moment. What they try to do is to integrate that knowledge into their larger cultural understanding of themselves and others and what truth is for that particular period of time. So one of the functions that I think the humanities have more generally, think about it for a second. Just think about 9/11 and you'll get the image right away. What happened? What's the image of 9/11? We have a group of people shouting out Allah Akbar as they fly high-tech planes into high-tech buildings. So we see that what's the failure there? Well, from one point of view, the failure there is that the changes in the modern world of technology and science and advanced economies and things like that come into radical conflict with older, pre-existing religious beliefs and religious expectations. So what's missing is the humanities. It's the humanities and the arts where the advances in science and technology on the one hand, and where people's needs for what Tom was talking about in his comment about faith, people's needs for faith, for coming to terms with their mortality, for understanding their larger cultural projects. It's in the humanities where these advances and developments can be integrated and can be worked on so that we can advance as not just as a particular society, but as a global community. Let's see, you've been wanting to say something?
I love the idea that humanities are going to solve the world's problems.
They're not going to solve them. No, they won't solve the problems. It's just the place where the conversation can take place, where that kind of integration can begin to occur. It's the place where the work can get done.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't think they'll solve the problem.
Oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's fine.
I was going to say that to that end, could you see religion and science there is a way that religion and science, because they're both sort of built on faith, they can actually get along.
It's a little easier. The answer is a little easier than the way you want to go with it. If you think historically, okay? So modern sciences research really doesn't start to occur until about 1543, or somewhere between 1543 and maybe 1630, in that 100 or so year period. Okay, but there was all kinds of knowing, right, that preceded the emergence of modern sciences research. So how does faith play into this? In the Will to Power notebooks, Nietzsche says it this way. He says, think about the importance that religion plays in the development of human thought and knowledge. If you think that the world might have been created by a God, then you can say to yourself, this world may have been created. If it's created, it has a plan. If it has a plan and it's created, maybe I can use my reason to figure it out. So it's in those earlier ways of positing something like faith in a divine creator that puts knowledge, puts thinking on a path towards science. Is that making so faith is a fundamental precondition, a fundamental genealogical precondition for the emergence of modern sciences research. Okay, that's Nietzsche's argument, and it's said a lot with a lot fewer words in the Will to Power notebooks. If I can, I'll post those for you too. Sure. I think are we all done? Have we run out of time?
Mm-hmm.
I think